Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Happy Thursday to you all. We have another fantastic show predicated upon college football. And this time, it's going to be more player profiles. We have an interesting crop of 4 guys, and then our last segment will actually be a win prediction, again, much like yesterday. But before we get into any of that, before we get into all the exciting prospects all of these players bring, I do want to remind you yet again to please like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned, and if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. This will be subject to change once I become a live show, so make yourselves available to all the ways you can interact with the show as I am live. You can ask questions through Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers. You can also leave tips and donations there, but as of right now, gsmc.cloud is the way to go for any tips and donations or questions, comments, or concerns about the show. Without further ado, let us jump right into today's show and today's players that I'm going to be examining. And the first player that I'm going to take a quick look at is a player who really hasn't fully realized his potential at a school where cranking out 5-star recruits was the norm in their former coach's era. I'm talking about Jimbo Fisher. I'm talking about Texas A&M. And this receiver was kind of the epitome of what could have been for Texas A&M. 5-star recruit, had all the potential in the world. Injuries maybe beset him, maybe the whole cultural and social divide that was kind of felt between coach and school came into play here. But now he's starting a new chapter in his college football career at beautiful Oregon, where he will be part of a wide receiver room that looks like it could be the best in the country, and he will have a quarterback who has been one of the most dominant college football QBs of the entire decade, I do believe that myself. And without further ado, let's jump right into the college football player profile of Evan Stewart. Last year was a weird year for Evan Stewart, and so many years for him at Texas A&M were weird years. 18 games, in fact, for Texas A&M for a former 5-star recruit, 1,163 yards and 6 TDs, and that was all he had in his Texas A&M career. Last year, he only had 38 catches for 514 yards and 4 touchdowns. So the majority of his production did come last year, but it was kind of rendered a moot point because Texas A&M were not competitive, and he really didn't get a chance to shine. His best game was 27.5 fantasy points in terms of fantasy against New Mexico, where he had 8 catches for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns. And his worst game was against Stanford. It was for a start, mind you, was actually against Alabama. 6.1 points, 3 catches, 46 yards, and 0 touchdowns. So the question concerning Evan Stewart was, well, why didn't he get his career going at Texas A&M? Why didn't he become what people thought he was going to be? Well, a lot of factors could have played in. Like I said, Jimbo Fisher may not have been the proper coach for him. He may have just been concerned about increasing the national profile of Texas A&M rather than seeing a result on the field. And perhaps that's what led to all these recruits coming in and not seeing their production immediately be a factor. But also, it could speak to perhaps the style of play that Texas A&M has. When I think about Texas A&M, I don't necessarily think about star receivers, even going all the way back to, say, the Johnny Manziel era. I think about receivers who just, in some way or another, fit the Texas A&M ethos. They're not necessarily true number one receivers who stand out, and they're not meant to be, because I feel like Texas A&M is more about gaining the most out of what your quarterback does in terms of distributing the wealth of the football. And I don't think that necessarily fit the profile of Evan Stewart. So why does he do this past offseason? He transfers to Oregon, where a lot of things could be in play for him. A lot of good scenarios and good outlooks could be in play for Evan Stewart this year. If we look at the Oregon wide receiver room, yes, there's already someone who is cemented as perhaps the true go-to number one receiver. And Tez Johnson had a fantastic season last year, even behind Troy Franklin, so you do expect him to get the lion's share of targets. You have Trayshawn Holden, another intriguing transfer out of Alabama, who also kind of wasn't necessarily viewed as someone who fit Alabama's ethos, where you definitely do think about star receivers in that Alabama scheme. And Trayshawn Holden, I guess, did not fit that profile, but I do like him from what I've seen of him. He's a savvy route runner, good hands, kind of nice after-contact speed as well. So this is a very well-rounded wide receiver room. And where Evan Stewart fits into it could be what separates Oregon from the rest of the Big 12. Or the Big 10, sorry. The reason why Oregon is viewed as a Big 10 contender is because not anything to do with the recruiting, because they've done very well. It's because they already know their kind of MO. If you saw last year, Bo Nix, outstanding dual threat abilities, really was one of his better seasons in college football. We know all his trials and tribulations. And also Troy Franklin, really becoming a nice go-to wide receiver, but also having the supplementary pieces. This is a very well-rounded overall team last year. And Dan Lanning is trying to recreate that through the portal, and he did that to a T. By bringing in Dillon Gabriel, we bring in perhaps the best dual-threat QB of the past decade. He has some of the most passing yards, could become the ultimate passing yards leader in college football history this season. And when I think about him, I think about someone who just competes at such a high level and gets the most out of his receivers in turn. Because if you think about Dillon Gabriel's career, he also was kind of in systems where the receivers were not the dominant forces we know them to be. At UCF, he certainly was the star. At Oklahoma, he certainly felt like he was the star. And now at Oregon, he's in a place where he definitely is going to profile as the big star of this offense. At the end of the day, he's the one with all the plaudits, all the accolades, and his name alone should excite a lot of Big Ten fans. But bringing in all these nice receivers, having Tez Johnson there, really makes a statement for Oregon. But here's where Evan Stewart is going to be the guy that can either sink the ship or keep it on course. When I think about wide receiver rooms and how wide receiver rooms are now viewed, especially in college football, as more and more teams dip into the transfer well, they're trying to find pieces that, while are semi-viewed as solid wide receiver twos, or maybe even wide receiver ones, like what Texas had to do, they're all concerned with filling out specific roles tailored to their teams. When I think about Oregon specifically, and I think about a guy like Tez Johnson, compared to Evan Stewart, who has had a very tumultuous career in college football where not a lot was steady. Maybe his whole mindset surrounding Texas A&M really took a toll on him, let's say. And he's just trying to get right. That could really impact his production, especially when Dillon Gabriel himself is new, and he's looking for someone to kind of connect himself with the system by. And so, when I think about Evan Stewart, yes, he's a fantastic wide receiver with a lot of potential, as we've seen with the way people viewed him in recruiting. I don't necessarily think it will translate as much to what Oregon sees in wide receiver twos. And this may seem like I'm dissuading you from picking him, but it's just something to be wary of as he transitions from a team where he wasn't necessarily viewed as someone who had all this potential, and they must use it to a team that really sees him as more of a supplementary part to a whole. If that makes any sense. If I were Dillon Gabriel, I would immediately target Tez Johnson. Because Tez Johnson, like I've said about so many different players in college football in the past, has cemented himself as someone who's experienced, and experience matters, like I often say. I'm not saying that Evan Stewart shouldn't be getting a number of targets. I do think that there's still value to him, but it's just in a different way than a player like Tez Johnson. Now, looking at Oregon's schedule, there are definitely places where you could really factor in Evan Stewart should you take him in fantasy college football. Because I think that the big games, a lot more will come down to individual quality. Say against Ohio State. That game will likely determine October 12th, a fantastic week in college football, if I do say so myself in terms of games. If right, it's a little bit push and pull kind of like a game. I feel like individual quality will separate that. So maybe shy away from picking Evan Stewart in that situation, because in terms of individual quality, while Dillon Gabriel can take over any college football game he's in, and Tez Johnson as his receiver could also play a big factor. But in the games where Oregon can really drag a team through the ringer, where you really expect them to show their team quality at the depth that they possess, Evan Stewart's the guy. And there are going to be games where Dillon Gabriel will take over. It's going to be games where Tez Johnson takes over. There will also be games where Evan Stewart might surprise some people because he still has a lot of value there. And it just hasn't been represented in the best way. And maybe this new fit at Oregon will help him. But that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we talk about one of the most versatile players in college football. You might not like that I'm talking about him, but he certainly could be an intriguing fantasy option should he play more as a wide receiver. You definitely don't want to miss this next segment. We'll be back after the break to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I would like to remind you guys yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. This will change in the future as I become a live show, but as of right now, any tips, donations, or even questions, comments, or concerns about the show should all be directed to gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let's get into perhaps the most intriguing, controversial segment of the day, if you will. Because this guy is a hybrid player through and through. A player like we haven't seen in college football. And I know that he's going to receive a lot of controversy this season for how he plays, how his coach plays him, how people perceive him in terms of his draft stock. But all in all, this guy, when he does play, at least on the offensive side of the ball, where he'll be most valued in fantasy college football, he is perhaps the best player we've seen doing this two-way kind of thing in college football, and that is, of course, Travis Hunter. Now, a lot of people might not like that I'm profiling Travis Hunter because, after all, he has played more defensively than offensively in recent years, and he's kind of viewed as more of a gadget guy, a surplus to all the talent Colorado has at the receiver position. But at the end of the day, if you can't exploit Travis Hunter for when Colorado is in these Big 12 shootouts, now that they are in the Big 12, I think that Travis Hunter could be a potent flex option for you in terms of fantasy college football. So let's look at his stats. As a receiver, 57 catches, 721 yards, 5 TDs, which in that Colorado setup is not bad by any means. You had a lot of variation in this Colorado offense. It didn't all go through Shedeur Sanders and Dylan Edwards last year. And it's not going to go through Dylan Edwards anymore because he's gone away. But there will be moments where Travis Hunter is really intriguing. For example, let's look at his best game. His best game on the offensive side of the ball was against Stanford. We all saw that game, where he also had his struggles on defense. So maybe that correlation could come into play in how you decide to use him. He had 13 catches, 140 yards, 2 TDs. His worst game was also against Colorado State. That was another famous game from last year for Colorado, where he only had 1.1 points. 2 catches, 21 yards, and 0 touchdowns. But now, here's how I view this Colorado wide receiver room. I'm going to go through all 3 of these guys, and they all have a very integral role that I can view them playing. You bring in transfer Will Sheppard from Vanderbilt. From what I hear about this kid is that he is someone who is going to be a savvy route runner. He's going to be more of like a wide receiver. He can play in the slot, maybe in the perimeter, but at the end of the day, he's going to be the intelligent IQ kind of receiver that we often talk about. The guy who can get open, understands situational football at its finest, and at the end of the day, will really add value and depth to this receiver room. Then you talk about Jimmy Horn. Jimmy Horn is also a very versatile player. Perhaps he plays in the slot even more because he's also a very savvy route runner. If you saw him last year, you know that he's very intelligent. He was one of Shedeur Sanders' favorite targets last year outside of Travis Hunter. So Jimmy Horn, he can also be a vertical threat. Look for more verticality from this Colorado offense, especially in a Big 12 that really values these shootout games, and I expect for Shedeur Sanders to be throwing the ball early and often downfield. And then we talk about Travis Hunter. What I see in Travis Hunter is really dependent on how Coach Prime plays his minutes. If he does profile more as a cornerback on the defensive side of football, if that's where Coach Prime places him, then that's kind of reducing what he can do offensively, because at the end of the day, Travis Hunter is perhaps the best deep threat on this Colorado wide receiver team core. And so, given that Travis Hunter adds so much value both offensively and defensively, it really is a balance here. Do you want Travis Hunter going more vertical offensively, risking his potential in terms of, say, man-to-man coverage in the defensive aspect of his game? Or do you really value Travis Hunter as a guy who profiles as that deep threat in your offense, coming at the risk of him playing less minutes on the defensive side of the ball where he is in fact your best player? And all of these questions really need to be answered in some way or form, because the Big 12 is an entirely different animal than the Pac-12, where you know that parity gets you far. In the Pac-12, Travis Hunter's skills were anomalous because Colorado did not have the depth and experience needed to beat teams like Oregon, Washington, Utah. Now that they're in the Big 12, they understand that the Big 12 is in a position where any team views any other team as someone that they can compete against. It's not a league where you have this set top guy. you can go in there and compete. And with Travis Hunter being such a wild card as he is, I think there will be games where it makes more sense for Colorado to start him offensively. And in those games, expect him to put up a lot of huge numbers. He may not get as many catches as we saw, but he is going to add value in terms of what those catches mean. And in fantasy college football, when you're looking at guys to fill out your roster, and you're looking at players who profile as either number 2 or number 3 receivers, and they're on teams that you expect to kind of be in the middle of the pack in their respective conferences, I think that's where the most value comes into play. Because say you're looking at guys on USC, let's say, or in the Big Ten, Washington, or something of that nature, and you're really focusing on, well, which guy profiles someone who will be in a lot of shootouts, maybe not win them all, but can get me a couple catches, a couple yards, a couple more touchdowns that I need to round out my team. Travis Hunter certainly feels like that guy. Now, the caveat to all this is, in recent rumors that have been surfacing surrounding Colorado and Travis Hunter, he has profiled more as a cornerback, and that's where all the skepticism about why I view him as such a valuable fantasy asset comes into play. Because in terms of fantasy, defense doesn't win you anything. It's the offense you value. And also remember, Travis Hunter is more injury prone than people may think, playing both ways. He missed 3 games with a lacerated kidney last year. It was a very harrowing injury for him, and in some games, he did not look like his former self. And so, it's all about balance here. It's all about understanding that Colorado knows what they have in him, but they don't necessarily want to push it over the edge, because Travis Hunter is certainly someone you don't want to fall off the cliff. He's someone that you want to stay the course with. And staying the course means guaranteeing that he's one of your most healthy players on the roster. And when I look at Colorado and their schedule, they have some good games. I believe they play Kansas State at home. That should be an interesting game. All of these games, they're playing teams that feel like they should win the Big 12. But know that this team in Colorado can play spoiler. Those are dangerous games, because those are the games I'm highlighting if you're someone who looks ahead to find out what matchups work best for the players you drafted. That's really where Hunter comes into play as the wild card, because he's someone that you really have to do your research on, delve deep into what you know about and what you hear about coming from that Colorado camp. Because at the end of the day, if I'm getting into the latter stages of a draft, and I feel like I don't necessarily have a receiver that has that level of parity to them, that has that level of understanding to them, and Travis Hunter, I could easily pull up his schedule, pick the games where I feel like he could be potent in, and then draft him based off those games. Because in terms of elite college receivers, you always think of guys who will actually get that significant amount of A, targets, B, playing time, and C, production. So you know those players much better than you know the guys who really are. And that's not the case with Travis Hunter. The Travis Hunter really came onto the scene because of his dual-threat ability on both sides of the ball. But the value that he adds, both in real life and in fantasy, stems from your understanding of him. Because it feels very apt to have skepticism about what Travis Hunter brings on the offensive side of the ball. Seeing as to how Colorado is addressing that wide receiver room. This could come back to hit me by saying that Travis Hunter adds a lot of value offensively. But if you're Colorado, wouldn't you also be kind of like a fantasy manager, picking and choosing the places where Travis Hunter makes more sense on the offensive side of the ball? Because the bottom line is, they're going to be in games that you think you can win. Where you're late in the third or fourth quarter, and you'll be like, well, I think we can win this thing. You have to take advantage of the wild card you have, and that wild card is Travis Hunter. And at the end of the day, I would be kind of foolish to not at least tell you that there will be games where Travis Hunter will be valued. That'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we transition to a true number one receiver, a guy whose connection with his quarterback is incredible to behold and looking to carry it over as well into the Big 12. You don't want to miss this segment. Coming up next.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you liked those first two segments. Those are two very different wide receivers. Someone with a lot of hope entering a new chapter in his career in Evan Stewart, and someone who is more of a wild card in Travis Hunter. But for our third segment, I give you a bona fide number one wide receiver. One of my favorite college football wide receivers heading into this season, with a true opportunity to see his star ascend even more. This guy really developed a rapport starting off in high school. This is something I only just found out, where him and his quarterback really found a dynamic aspect of their game. And now, in a new season with a new head coach, mind you, he and his team are looking to really make waves in the Big 12, in a conference where anything can happen. And that player is, of course, Mr. Tetairoa McMillan. Oops, I gave a little preview of the next player. Tetairoa McMillan. Let's talk about him a little bit. I think that in terms of pure college football wide receivers, you can't get any better than having a guy like him on your roster. In terms of how Arizona plays as well, and how they played once his high school friend and quarterback Noah Fafita came in, really shows and tells the story of an Arizona team really looking to become dynamic. And this team, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the most dynamic in all of college football, and they are going to surprise a lot of people even more this season. Because last season they snuck up on everybody once Fafita came into the picture. But now they're surprising no one. And their move to the Big 12 is a move that is sharp and smart for the direction of this program. Now, there are certain things that could slip up along the way for this program, and that is they have a new head coach in Brent Brennan. Not necessarily tested in terms of Power 5 coaching. He did coach at SJSU and really helped them get into the national spotlight, but this is a different thing. If you're a coach coming into a program that hasn't really had that much success at the FBS level in college football and wants to get into the national spotlight, most importantly, you really have to have a nuanced approach, because what Jed Fish did with this group last year was really indicative of a change in the narrative. It really showed what Arizona wants and desires to become in terms of national respect. And it all starts with this QB wide receiver duo in Noah Fafita and Tetairoa McMillan. Last year, I wouldn't have been mad at you if you said that Tyrone McMillan was not necessarily viewed as the number one wide receiver. He did play like a number one wide receiver for Arizona, but he had Jacob Cowing, who's gone to the NFL, in front of him. Now that Cowing is gone, this role is Tyrone McMillan's to lose. And he's not going to. 90 catches last year, 1,402 yards, 10 TDs, 10.7 yards per target. His best game last year was against Mississippi State, 26.1 fantasy points, 8 catches, 161 yards, 1 touchdown. His worst game was against Stanford, where he only had 4 catches for 76 yards and 4.6 fantasy points. Now, when we think about the guys we talked about earlier, those are guys who really profile as filler to a fantasy roster. Tyrone McMillan is someone that you're going to swing for the fences on. He's going to go very highly in a lot of fantasy college football drafts. In fact, he might go as the first wide receiver off the board, if you want my humble opinion. And the reason being is, when I think of how Arizona will profile this year, I don't necessarily know the offensive direction Brent Brennan might take, but I certainly know that you can't necessarily break up the duo of Noah Fafita and Tyrone McMillan. If you were to look at the rest of Arizona's roster, you wouldn't necessarily be able to pinpoint a player who truly stands out outside of Tyrone McMillan. I don't know if Brent Brennan is going to diagnose that problem, but it's certainly not a problem that you feel will hinder Arizona because of the strength of Fafita and McMillan as a duo. But I think the whole reason that Tyrone McMillan could be picked so highly is A, because they're in the Big 12, and B, there really is no one that I really view on this Arizona roster that can really elevate this team and get them into the national spotlight outside of him. He truly ascended his game last year to ascend Arizona into the national spotlight, and this year I think he's primed to do it again. Let's talk about this Arizona team in terms of how they will attack the Big 12. The Big 12 really suits them as a team in terms of what they bring to the table. If we look at all the other teams in the Big 12, you look at the teams that have been there already in Kansas State, Oklahoma State, teams of that nature. You think about teams that have tried to build through this process, and Arizona has done just that. They might not be at the level. Some of you might think, well, Arizona didn't necessarily have to work that hard. You know what I mean? They kind of stumbled into this dynamic duo, and they really got going again. But if you really break it down, not only does Arizona profile as a Big 12 team through and through, they are the quintessential Big 12 team, and here's why. If you think about Big 12 teams, like I said about teams before, Big 12 teams don't predicate themselves on QB wide receiver duos. Now, you might be wondering why now I think that Arizona is the quintessential Big 12 team. It's not necessarily about the duo. It's about the necessity that Fafita and McMillan bring to each other. They feed off each other. And that's what I hope Brent Brennan will diagnose. Because at the end of the day, Tyrone McMillan's job shouldn't be in jeopardy as the wide receiver one for this offense. But it definitely could be sullied by Brent Brennan not viewing this duo as the main hope of this team. I'm not saying that Arizona's offense is bad outside of McMillan. It's just that one guy out of all of these players might be needed to be elevated, and Tyrone McMillan did that to a T. And so, looking at the Big 12, I think that the reason why I'm not sleeping on Arizona again this year is because if I look at all these teams, they might get caught up in distribution of wealth. If you look at Kansas State, for example, they're incorporating Avery Johnson into this offense. They have so many good pieces, a lot of talented pieces. But are they guys who elevate, or guys who really need that production to sustain their levels of success? I look at Oklahoma State. Yeah, Ollie Gordon II was fantastic last year. Yeah, he really stepped up. But it was anomalous because Alan Bowman really didn't step up. There were a lot of question marks surrounding how Big 12 teams use and utilize their best players. And with Arizona, I don't really view that as a question mark. Tyrone McMillan is going to receive the lion's share of the targets in this team, and they will be better for it. And I can't say that about many Big 12 teams. And I know it's weird to talk about a guy who really tips the balance in terms of balanced wide receiver rooms, because he's someone who really wasn't seen as a wide receiver one last year, but this year is the year where Arizona becomes a team that you're not necessarily worried about in terms of outside production. If Brent Brennan allows this Fafita-McMillan connection to breathe, if he sees that Jedd Fisch was right to really hone in on allowing Noah Fafita and Tyrone McMillan to understand each other, then this team is going to be very dangerous. And when I think about the wide receiver profile in college football, outside of, trying to build balanced wide receiver rooms, let's talk about the wide receiver ones in college football for a little bit. If you go through recent history and you look at examples of receivers who really transcended what it means to have parity in a wide receiver room, you look at a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., who really actually limited Emeka Egbuka last year. If you look at maybe Devontae Smith, where in his final season he vaulted his status, won the Heisman because of it, in fact. When you look at players of that nature, it really makes sense to allow them to be the superstars they are. Because at the end of the day, that's where you actually get a lot of variation from. If you have a wide receiver so scary that they're so dominant that they get the lion's share of targets every single game, you know they're the number one receiver on their team, then that allows for other players to come into the spotlight, to come into the public eye. That's what Tyrone McMillan does. He's going to add more value in terms of fantasy by allowing his teammates to shine in certain moments than him actually being the go-to receiver, if that makes sense. But he still is going to be the go-to receiver, and he still is going to put up a lot of stats. It's just that the way he plays allows for a lot more parity, if that makes sense, a lot more variation, because if Noah Fafita and McMillan's connection rings true, that it's more dangerous because of what's not happening. Now you have to account for players that you usually would have homed in on a lot more, being like, okay, if we can lock them down, maybe then Fafita won't distribute the ball to them. You're so focused on McMillan that you lose other players. And so that's the value that McMillan brings, not just in real life or in fantasy, but to the value of the sport itself. And I know I'm kind of rambling on about what it means to be this kind of wide receiver, but it really does matter, especially when you're pinpointing certain aspects of your fantasy football team. If you really want a solid wide receiver one, perhaps the best in college football, then by all means, Tyrone McMillan will be your guy. But at the end of the day, the reason why I'm presenting all three of these kind of receivers in the way that I did is because you certainly have to have a sense of optimism about what you think these players will be. And if not, that it could be detrimental to how you draft. Tyrone McMillan, out of all of those players I mentioned today, is perhaps the best. But supplementing the best is what could be key. That's just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we have a player I'm actually very familiar with, played in the state of Jersey in high school, now making a name for himself still in Jersey as one of the most underrated running backs in the country. You definitely don't want to miss this next segment because he could be a hidden gem in fantasy college football.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are transitioning away from wide receiver talk and how interesting that wide receiver market is going to be in fantasy college football to a running back who you may not have heard of, but I am very familiar with. Actually seen this young man live in high school playing for Don Bosco Prep, one of my high school's rivals, and seeing his growth as a running back in a Rutgers system that really values running the football. A Greg Schiano offense tailored to his assets. I think that this guy, you definitely don't want to sleep on this year. So without further ado, the college football player profile of Kyle Monangai. Now, the running back market in terms of college football is very much like the NFL fantasy football running back market, in that you feel there are a lot of top tier guys. Judkins is a no-brainer. Henderson might be even a no-brainer. Ollie Gordon II might be a no-brainer. Ashton Jaunty out of Boise State, no-brainer. And then you have some guys in programs that don't believe get the respect they do, who really sneak up on you. And when you look at Rutgers, who I'm very familiar with, I see a lot of their games and I'm familiar with how they play. Not knowing the name Kyle Monangai will be very detrimental. Because the bottom line is, Rutgers uses a lot of different run schemes. They try and ground you down. That's their physicality in terms of their style. And knowing what I've seen live and transferring it to the Rutgers way, Kyle Monangai is someone that you have to keep your eye on. Now let's talk about Rutgers as a whole this season. I don't necessarily think that Rutgers are a team who are going to steadily improve. They're going to stay in this weird stasis where they're around 500 or so for quite some time. And it's not a knock against, their coaching style. It's just that the style of play is highly reminiscent of an older era. And it should surprise teams a little bit, the way they play. But it's not something that you're going to win with comfortably every single time, especially in this Big Ten. But when you are a team predicated on the run, you need a special kind of running back, and Kyle Monangai fits that profile. And now, with Gavin Wimsatt gone, who, if you do know Rutgers, is seen as one of their rushing quarterbacks, and a team that really values a quarterback who runs more often than he throws, that's something you often see in Rutgers games, outside of maybe the short-lived Noah Vedral era. You really need someone who is a workhorse in nature in early downs, but understands the situation wherever the football is on the field. You need a guy who can get you the 1 yard rushing touchdown, but you also kind of want the guy who can get you the 60-yard rushes that can really shock defenses with his speed. And Kyle Monangai, I saw it firsthand. He's a special player. This year could profile to be perhaps his best year, and it should really allow you to see the value he adds as a fantasy player as well. Last year's stats were astounding. 242 carries, 1,262 yards, 8 TDs, 5.2 yards averaged. His best performance was against Virginia Tech. That's a very good team considering where they are. 33.1 fantasy points, 16 carries, 143 yards, 3 TDs. His worst game is 8 carries, 16 yards, 0 points, 1.6. And so, the thing about Kyle Monangai that I really like is that when you look at the yardage totals, they're not eye-popping. But when you look at the performance, that was his best game. 16 carries, 143 yards. The 3 TDs are what stand out to me. Because I don't remember the game, but he could have gotten those TDs in 3 different ways. That's not something you can say very often about college football running backs. If you go through a list of running backs who really have that explosiveness after contact, let's say, or have that explosiveness in terms of open field play. You think about guys like Judkins, you think about guys like Gordon, but very rarely do you find a player who is highly valued for his rushing ability and also combines all the aspects of all the college football running backs you love in such a way that helps this team, who's using such an archaic style of play, actually be relevant. That's the thing. If you're a Rutgers fan and you watch Rutgers consistently, you understand how much of a value Kyle Monangai is in real life at the very least. If you're just playing fantasy football and you're leafing through running backs and trying to decipher whether or not you want an explosive guy or a guy who's a workhorse, you might gloss over Kyle Monangai because you might be unfamiliar with Rutgers. You might just think that Rutgers are a team that's not taken seriously because of X and Y factors that you don't know. But I challenge you this. Watch a Rutgers game and see what Kyle Monangai does in it. See the little spaces where he understands the nuances of situational football and see how you view him then, because he's going to be special. And now looking at the Rutgers roster. When I look at the Rutgers roster, I don't necessarily think that, Schiano doesn't see his receivers as valuable. It's just that his receivers really pick and choose their spots, if you know what I mean. When I think about a Rutgers receiver who probably profiled as someone you would want on a top Power 5 team, maybe Bo Melton would have been that guy had he been playing at a Power 5 team that valued his assets. But at the end of the day, that's not what Rutgers is. And I look at this new team. Afan Kaliakmanis of Minnesota comes in. At the very best, he's probably serviceable, is what I'll call him. You don't have many good receivers right now. Maybe Christian Jamel will step up. Only had about 460 yards last year. The brother of Kaliakmanis, Dino Kaliakmanis, maybe that brotherly connection comes into play. But at the end of the day, when I think about all Greg Schiano has done, he's found so many different ways to say, hey, we need you in the run game. He did it with Jonathan Lewis, a former St. Peter's prep quarterback. Shout out to him. He did it with Johnny Langan, another Jersey stalwart who also was predicated on running the football when he was at Bergen Catholic in high school. So he finds different ways to utilize the run game with so many different players. And I bet you this season, even with Kaliakmanis, who profiles as more of a passer, who definitely is more of a pocket passer at that, not necessarily someone I would view as a dual threat player. This will really open up the window for Kyle Monangai to show that he's not just, a workhorse guy who Greg Schiano knows is his wild card. He's going to be the wild card for Rutgers. And he's going to be the reason why a lot of people might watch more Rutgers games than not, because he adds so much excitement to the running back position for Rutgers that they need. Because if they didn't have a solid running back, they wouldn't have a offense supplemented by someone who can actually play Greg Schiano's system. And the reason why a lot of people can't gloss over that is because in college football terms, it's always easy to go for explosiveness in the run game. You're always looking to hit the home run every single time. But the home run for Rutgers is getting a 6-yard gain, 5 to 6 yard gain, then seeing if wearing down the defense can get you a 6-yard gain. It's a chess game for them, and Kyle Monangai is the best chess piece on the board for them. You can't necessarily gloss over a running back just because he's viewed more tactically than most. If I were a fantasy football manager and it came down to, say, Ollie Gordon or Kyle Monangai, I would pick Kyle Monangai because there will be games where he's disappointing. Because there will be games where Rutgers' system will not work because they're against far superior teams. But when he does have the opportunities, and he does understand the nuances of the game, he's a very special, important player that you can't gloss over just because he's on Rutgers. And when I think about this year, especially for them, I think he's going to be a bigger weapon than most teams. There's no competition in the Rutgers running room outside of him. And so he needs to use that to his advantage, and if he does, the sky's definitely the limit for him. That will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we have our only win projection predictions of the day for USC. We're going out west for them after the break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the day on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. This will be our only win projection prediction segment of the day. It's for a team who really is in a transitional period but in a weird way, where there's a lot of confidence stemming from them, even though there are some players that we are not familiar with on this team. As they go to the Big Ten, I think that this USC team really needs at least some modicum of success in certain games to truly garner the respect they will deserve in the Big Ten. So without further ado, let's talk about them a little bit and their win projections. The over-under for them is actually very low for a team that prides itself on building through the depth they have. And this year will be no different. When I think about what Lincoln Riley has done, he has really brought along so many different quarterbacks, mainly because they've chosen to stick with him. Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray at Oklahoma, Caleb Williams following him to USC when he got the job. Caleb Williams building up his repertoire, becoming the number one pick in the draft last year. there are a lot of factors that go into what makes USC such an intriguing team, but also why they don't have the national profile that they have had in years past. And I think it all stems down to not just, the defensive side of the ball, because everyone knows that Lincoln Riley doesn't necessarily focus on the defensive aspects of the game. I think it's more about the team itself not necessarily being caught up in what it means to be a USC Trojan. I think that everyone coming into USC just wants to play for Lincoln Riley to get to a certain point in their career, because everyone loves Lincoln Riley for what he's doing for their game. But I don't necessarily think it's for the sake of winning and competing. That's what Lincoln Riley wants to do. He did it with Oklahoma, and if he wants to do it with USC, something has to change within the program, the players itself, to really buy into that mindset. And I think this year is going to be much tougher, because in the Big Ten, I think that while there will be certain games where USC should feel it can compete, it just doesn't necessarily profile as a scary team, because you don't know who is going to be the new guy to step up on offense to really help USC make the difference between 6 or 7 wins or maybe 8 or 9 wins. And so the over-under feels appropriate right now. 7.5 wins. And the only reason I'm taking the over is because if Lincoln Riley can get the best out of Miller Moss, we'll talk about a little bit throughout this segment, then I do believe that USC has just enough to get past the Big Ten teams that they should be beating on their schedule. But at the end of the day, when I think about how they profile nationally right now, and I view all these other teams who are hopeful, even if they themselves are kind of in quote-unquote transitional periods, there's more hype surrounding them than I feel there is with USC. And I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect between player and coach when it comes to total buy-in to a plan that they can get to the CFP in the future. I think that USC needs to find a nice happy medium where all the players can buy in, realize that this isn't the year they can compete, but know that they want to compete in the future. And Lincoln Riley has to figure out kind of that way to get that into their minds quickly. Let's talk about their roster for a second. Let's start off with Miller Moss. There is a lot of hype surrounding him, supposedly because of that Holiday Bowl that he had. 6 touchdowns, 300 yards. It certainly seems like he won over a lot of people. But I'm still skeptical, because when I look at players who are in a similar situation to him, Nico Yamalieva, you think about maybe you can throw Avery Johnson in there. Even a guy like Connor Wigman, who really did assume the starting role at Texas A&M, but injuries kind of beset him there. I don't necessarily think you should place as much weight in that one game as people think. Because if I think about the basis that Lincoln Riley has to work with, I think that we already kind of knew that Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray had the star potential to them before, Baker Mayfield had experience at Texas Tech before Oklahoma. Kyler Murray kind of worked his way through the system as well. And Caleb Williams, of course, followed him, was willing to follow him to USC to learn under his tutelage. Learn under him at Oklahoma for a little bit. Miller Moss is someone who hasn't had that. Yes, he sat behind Caleb Williams, saw what the offense should look like, understands that Lincoln Riley expects a lot out of him being the QB in the system, but I just don't see how it will translate to a Big Ten where he's going to have to grow up quick. Now, he's a junior, so he has had enough time to develop in the system behind Caleb Williams. But I don't necessarily think he's going to be as successful as, say, a Carson Beck, because he does have the sense of unknownness. Whereas Carson Beck, you kind of got a lot of hype surrounding him, and he also had the weapons at his disposal. I'm not saying that USC doesn't have weapons. We'll talk with them in a bit. But I'm saying that Miller Moss just doesn't necessarily have a pathway forward to success, much like players who are in a similar situation. I look at his weapons. You have Zachariah Branch. He's a nice gadget guy. He had over 320 yards last year. Mekhi Lemon, Jacoby Lane. These are all interesting players. This is a young receiving core who should be hungry, and if they buy into Lincoln Riley's thing, that's fantastic for him and Mr. Miller Moss. But if you just take this USC team at face value and you place Miller Moss into the system and say you're our QB1, and you show him a list of young wide receivers who, while exciting, haven't necessarily had the experience, then what does that tell you about how this roster looks against the Big Ten? Like I said, I'm still taking the over after telling you all of this, but it's going to be a tough over. And when I look at their schedule, it certainly profiles as one where you really have to be careful in how you play each of these games. They open against LSU. LSU is also a perfect example of what USC could be, because if you look at LSU, they're in a very similar situation. Garrett Nussmeier comes in as the QB in place of Jaden Daniels. He's had some experience. He also had a lot of success stemming from that bowl game. They also have a lot of receivers that are young. Kyron Lacey. You have transfers as well, CJ Daniels. So this game is going to be one of those games where you have to kind of really get down to the nitty-gritty details of how you want to play this out, because both of these guys, this will just be their truly second game as a full-time starter for their respective teams. And both of them have these receiver rooms that are really weird. But I think the thing that separates LSU is that they have a kind of credo to live by here. Brian Kelly has had experience understanding what ways to get the best things out of his quarterbacks. And Lincoln Riley only has had that one game with Miller Moss to truly diagnose. So this is going to be an interesting game. I think that USC could win this game to really set the tone for their season, but it's going to be a very, not necessarily a good QB battle, but it could come down to hard tacks here. It could come down to the little details and nuances of the game. And if Lincoln Riley doesn't necessarily instill in this offseason a faith in Miller Moss that says, hey, this is going to be a grind of a season, but just enjoy it and play to the best of your abilities, then I don't necessarily see a pathway forward where USC could win this game. Then they're on the road against Michigan and Washington. Two teams also in weird transitional periods, but two teams as well who I think that I humbly think that they should lose to. And here's why. While both of them are much worse off, quote unquote, than you would say they were a couple years ago, these are teams that are predicated on identity. Michigan, for example, they're not going to change. I don't think Washington's going to change that much. Will Rogers is certainly a different quarterback than Michael Penix, but I certainly feel as if they too will kind of predicate themselves on at least attempting to maintain that. And without that identity, I don't feel like USC will be able to catch up to them. And then two games that I think are winnable for them are Penn State at home and Notre Dame at home. Those are the games that they should really target, because that's where I think you can take advantage of, potential systems not necessarily being fully gelled. At Penn State, that Drew Allers had his struggles as well. And at Notre Dame, Riley Leonard, yes, he's one of the better college football quarterbacks you would want, but he has had a lengthy injury history. So at the end of the day, it's all about whether or not you believe that Lincoln Riley can instill in Miller Moss a faith that he is the right guy. Because if you place your faith in Miller Moss from the get-go and you really let him loose, then I think you'll have the necessary freedom to surprise people. But if he doesn't have that freedom to play to the best of his abilities, then I don't necessarily see much hope for USC. Well, just about do it for this show. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe if you do feel so inclined to the show and the network. It is a huge support to everyone concerned. Leave a tip or donation for now at the link gsmc.cloud. It could change in the future, but for now, gsmc.cloud is the way to go. Thank you guys yet again. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow to finish off the week. We will see you then.